The reality is most people mess this up before they even get started. If I had known these things before starting medical school, I would have saved myself from so much pain and I would have saved myself so much time. I've been in medical school almost a year and a half now, and in this video, I'll share with you 7 key things that you'll need to know before getting started. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what to expect from the lifestyle changes in medical school without figuring it out when it's already too late and wasting time like I did. If you stick around to the end of this video, I'll also share with you an extra tip for those of you that are applying or planning to apply. All right, let's start with one of the biggest changes to expect before starting, and that's you will never be done with exams and learning. I remember asking one of my friends the first week of medical school, do we really have an exam every single week for the rest of this semester? And he said, no, we have an exam every single week for the next 18 months. And that anecdotal story is really a small example of everything that happens in your medical journey, because you will really never be done learning. Even when you graduate and go to residency, you'll have board exams that you need to take to get certified for your specialty. After that, if you want to go into fellowship, you'll need to train more. And that's not to mention, if you're in your career, you still have to be recertified every few years and take exams. But the point here is that if you're involved in a medical occupation like medicine, you need to always be learning, not only learning from classrooms or education or books, but from your patients. You're always going to be gaining new information, and research will always be being conducted and new things found out about medications, treatment plans, and really the entire field. Now, with that being said, something that's really important to consider before you go into medical school is if that's something you're interested in. Many people always talk about being a lifelong learner, and that's really embodied in the field of medicine. So if you know that you're somebody that really hates classes and just cannot wait to be out of them and into the workforce, it's something to really consider if you are thinking about going into medicine, because these really will not end. Although you won't be sitting with a bunch of other peers in desks and taking written exams or being graded on a scale, you will be always synthesizing new information and keeping your brain sharp, so that way you can take care of people at the best of your ability. In my own experience, I can tell you that this is something I really enjoy, and a lot of my classmates, at least that I talk to, have also really enjoyed, and it's part of the personality of being in medicine, but at the end of the day, it's something that you need to consider before you decide for sure that you want to go to medical school. All right, so tip number 2 is that even though you are not a PhD student, you can expect to be doing research or at least involved in some sort of research for the next 8 years. So in medical school, for many of you that don't know, when you're applying to residency, you'll need to be doing research. Many people did research before they even applied to medical school in their undergraduate institutions or in their gap years. After this, when you go to residencies, many of them require that you do research. Now, most of this is actually just going to depend on the specialty that you're involved in, but I can tell you that for the most part, from the moderately competitive specialties up to the most competitive specialties, and generally in academic medical settings, you're going to be having research that's mostly case-based, so not necessarily lab-based or where you're pipetting all the time, but you're going to be looking at patient charts, or you're going to be doing systematic reviews to find the most up-to-date research in the field. Now, I know research is not for everybody, and this is not to say that if you really don't like research, you shouldn't do medical school. Now, I will say this is going to be very person to person, and I will say that many of the smartest people I know in my medical school are really not interested in research and don't enjoy it that much. And I think this is also partly because people don't get involved in research projects that genuinely interest them. And for some people, that's very difficult to do. But with that being said, I think it's healthy to set an expectation that you're going to be involved in research, whether you want to or not, if that is something that aligns with your career interests, which it does for most people. This doesn't end right after undergrad, and you will still continue to be involved in research in medical school and in residency. For me personally, what this looks like is I will spend most of my time doing academic studies, so I will be doing flashcards or reading new content, but in the meantime, sometimes over the weekends or when I have a period of downtime after a big exam, this is the time that I will try to work on some of the research projects that I have at hand, and a lot of times that's working on presenting posters and applying to conferences in local areas, or developing a manuscript to hopefully be published, and a lot of these projects will overlap with one another in that aspect. It's nice to not only be doing one thing though, like only studying, so having these research projects really diversifies the interests that you're involved in. All right, so the third key thing to know before getting started with medical school is that you'll have to get over your FOMO, or your fear of missing out. I remember having a conversation with one of my older friends who was already in med school before I was applying to medical school and asking him, "Do you really have to say no to things when your friends ask you to hang out?" And he said, "Of course, that you have to many times. There are simply too many things on your plate for you to be able to do everything, especially to have the expectation that you'll be doing as much as you did socially in undergrad or in your gap years. And to be honest, that's perfectly expected by most people. Sometimes, though, you don't fully realize this until you get into medical school and you get invited out to hang out before you have a big exam, and you do have to be the one that says no to things. After a while, this is kind of like a muscle, and you get to develop it and you get stronger at it. So it becomes easier to say no, and your friends and social groups will start to understand that you're very busy. But it can be a very difficult jump to get over if you weren't expecting it before medical school began. I will say though, depending on the university that you go to, there will always be room in your academic calendar set aside for students to have free time in order to hang out with their family. And you can always take off time if you need to go to an important event. So the way it works at my school is that once we start our clerkship rotations through the hospital, we'll have 8 different blocks of several weeks. And 6 of those blocks you will be on a rotation in the hospital, but you have 2 free blocks which you can choose to do anything you want with your time. A lot of students will choose to do extracurricular activities like research. Some students will work on studying, obviously to prep for board exams, and some students will also use that time to hang out and be social and connect with their friend groups that they don't otherwise get to see all the time while they're in medical school. And this is really useful to check before you apply to a specific medical school. Look at their calendars, look at the way they set up their academics, talk to the medical students that go to that school just to make sure that you will have the time that you require to set aside for it. And again, it's going to be different for everybody. Not everyone needs to have several weeks off a year in order to function, but for those people that do, it's important to realize that you're going to have that time beforehand. For my medical school, we used to have summer breaks off before we transferred to this block format, but I know many other medical schools still have a summer break, and that's a time to be able to do an internship or again, to hang out and spend time with people. At the end of the day, medical school is one of the most rigorous academic undertakings, so you should not expect to have free time all day, every day, and you will have to say no to many things, so expect to do that before you start. The fourth thing, and this one took me so long to figure out, is that there is no perfect study strategy. In fact, if somebody tries to come up to you and tell you that there is a perfect study strategy, just run the opposite direction because they're not leaving room for nuance. One thing that you start to realize in medical school is that you will figure out the study strategy that works right for you because you're going to be required to. And that is different for almost every single person in my class. I know some people that always love going religiously to every single lecture. I know people that almost go to no lectures whatsoever and purely do third-party content. And I know many people that are a hybrid of both. Some people only read books like first aid to get their content. The point is that you should expect when you start medical school to spend a few weeks dialing in what works best for you. Don't be afraid to do trial and error to figure out what works for you and to talk to other people, because if you don't and you expect to adopt somebody else's strategy, you may figure out a year down the road that that wasn't the strategy that worked for you. And by that point, it's already too late because you only have so much time to learn content in medical school. Personally, when I'm talking to students in the class below me that ask me what a good study strategy is, I always make this disclaimer before I start, and I say, this is the strategy that has worked best for me, but it's going to be different for every person. And I think one of the key points here is that you should adopt small things that you like from each person's study strategy and pick the things that work and remove the things that don't until you're left with something that works well for you. If somebody says that something is the study strategy and that there is no other way, it's simply not going to be true because other study strategies exist for a reason. And I think that talking to other medical school students helped me realize this because I was able to synthesize as much information as I could in those first few weeks and then slowly just close off my ears to all the other strategies and just decide what is going to work for me. There's always going to be 2 layers to it, the things that you can learn and the things that actually work for you. Specifically in the past, I used to try to design the perfect study sessions with a Pomodoro strategy, have the exact desk setup that I wanted, make sure that I knew exactly what I was going to be doing before getting started. And now my strategy is completely different. I just tried to remove everything that's not the thing that I'm doing and go from there. And this may change a little bit as you go through medical school. So for each board exam, perhaps you'll have a different study strategy that works for you. Or when you start in the hospital versus when you're not in the hospital, you're going to have specific time periods that work well for you or specific study strategies like practice questions that you don't have access to before. So Be slightly adaptable, but also understand that you're going to have your own strategy and to listen to what works for you. So the fifth key is to shadow and explore now, because the earlier you know your specialty of interest, the easier your life will be. So for me, what this looked like was in undergrad, I would volunteer in the local hospital and I shadowed whenever I had a break. Not all the time, but just the specialties that I thought were interesting. I had a lot of friends that also worked in clinics, and I personally did this as well. And it's funny because the clinic I worked in, I actually was easily able to rule out as an area of interest for me because I just didn't enjoy what I was doing. Outside of this, what you should do is research specialties and create a list starting with 1 through however many specialties you find that you think are interesting, and start shadowing them from the most interested to the least interested so that you can slowly develop a list and refine your exact taste in what you would like in a future job. The other thing is that a lot of times you don't often know specialties that even exist. So if possible, also look online at certain online quizzes or look at your personality type to decide what specialties exist out there that you might not even know about that align with your personality or with your interest in the field of medicine. So here's the deal. In medical school, when you're on rotation in the hospital, at least in my school, you get 6 core rotations, which are the bread and butter medical specialties. These are things like family medicine, pediatrics, OB-GYN, surgery, internal medicine, neurology, and psychology. So outside of those specialties, if you would like to shadow something else, it's on your own undertaking, and you have electives where you can decide the things that you're interested in. So the point here is that if you know your specialty of interest, you can more quickly decide which elective you want to take, and for the other elective block, you can use that time to study and focus more on your board exams and things that don't require you to ascertain the exact specialty that you want to pursue. If anything, it just streamlines your time in medical school so that you can focus more on the things and the goals that are right in front of you instead of still trying to figure out what the end goal itself is, if that makes sense. So another thing is that residencies are slowly becoming more and more centric on the amount of research that students are doing. In fact, outside of students' Step 2 score, one of the most important indicating factors for matching in U.S. medical residencies is the research that students do. Now, with that being said, you might be asking what type of research. Oftentimes, students have a broad area of interest with research specialties, but for the more competitive specialties, it's very important that you do research within that field of interest. So what that means is, even when you're in your pre-clerkship or your training portion of your medical school career, if you have an area of interest that you're almost certain that you want to pursue, you can use that time to focus in and narrow in on that research opportunity that is going to be specific for your field of interest, and that's only going to bolster your application and show residencies that you are certain that that is the one that you're most interested in. This is something that I didn't even realize before coming to medical school. In fact, when you're applying to residencies, you can only apply to one. So you have to pick a field of interest, and most students declare their field of interest in their 3rd year, which means their declared specialty is the one that they'll be applying to. Again, the sooner you figure this out, the better for the tasks that you're doing. Now, what that didn't even touch on is the fact that earlier on, if you decide, you're able to network better, because oftentimes that research that you're doing, whether you're going to conferences or working with PIs on your project that are in your field, you're going to be able to expand that network, expand your expertise in the field, be able to talk more about that. It'll apply to your rotations. And even outside of research, the time that you're not spending trying to decide on your specialty of interest, you're able to apply to more leisurely activities, including studying, but also just going to the gym, taking care of yourself, hanging out with friends and family, which we all know we need to do more of in medical school. All right, so this goes hand in hand and transitions me perfectly into point number 6, which is to go ahead and reflect on your values. Oftentimes when you're choosing a specialty in the first place, people don't even realize that they're deciding between many dichotomies in order to find the specialty that best matches their interests. For example, do you want to be patient-facing and listening to the stories, seeing those patients and the way that they improve? Or would you rather be removed from that setting, doing something like radiology, pathology, or even in the OR most of the time? Some other points to consider include, do you care about longitudinal care? AKA, do you want to see that patient for recurring visits every few months and monitor their improvement and make sure that they're doing okay? Or are you okay with only seeing a patient once? The other thing is that, do you want to have life-saving interventions, or are you okay with just managing a patient on a more consistent basis? So do you want to work in an ER, in an outpatient setting? Do you want to work in an inpatient setting in the hospital, managing people? Do you want to work in a hospital in the first place, or do you want to work outside of a hospital in a clinic? And the other thing, which I think is one of the most important things to consider, is how much do you care about the lifestyle of the specialty that you're interested in? Now, one of the best ways I've heard this framed is that you want to choose a specialty that you're okay with doing at 25 years old and also at 65 years old. So you don't want to sacrifice one of those for the other, and you want to make sure that there's a balance there. Now, with that being said, I think some people automatically discount specialties that they perceive to be really bad lifestyles, even though they're interested in the subject. And I think it's always important to consider that if you are very passionate about something, you will be able to find a form of that career where you're able to balance the lifestyle and the interest that you have. For you, that may be working in an educational form of that specialty or even part-time, but it is important to consider that there are ways around these difficulties. And that brings me to my seventh and final key point, which is if you haven't already started thinking about your mental health, now is a great time to start. Don't wait until before medical school, because oftentimes I think of this as a win rather than an if. Some people like to think, if this happens, I'll deal with it then. But you should assume that if you're going into something very intense like medical school, that it is a win of when you're going to need that space for mental clarity or to stabilize yourself mentally from something that's very difficult, that's ongoing in your life. You may be able to deal with the difficulties of medical school, but oftentimes there are extraneous things that are outside of our control, perhaps in our family or social life, that are going on outside of our control when we're in medical school. And when you add those two things together, that's when disaster occurs. If you've already thought about this before and you've already made a plan for it, whether that's working out or meditating or staying in touch with your faith, these are all ways that you can circumvent these problems so that when they do arise, you're already prepared to deal with them rather than deciding what to do when the time comes. What this all really boils down to is that if you don't take care of your mind, it won't take care of you. And I think a lot of people forget that your brain is a part of your body at the end of the day. It sounds really simple to say, but if you're not taking care of your health, you're not watching out for what you're eating, and you're not making sure that you have square meals every single day, that your needs are not attended to, that you're resting properly, that you're exercising and keeping your body moving, these things will all kind of collapse around themselves. And especially when you're busy all the time, this just makes that so much worse because we, at the end of the day, are using our brains all the time in school. The second part of this point is to be very intentional about what's important to you. It sounds really rough to say, but you simply do not have the time to care about everything going on around you, and you will not care about everything going on around you. The quicker you can decide on what's actually important to you, the quicker you can remove all the other things and focus really on what's important. Now, oftentimes what people will decide is that comparing themselves to the people around them is something that's important to you. And to that, I would say, do not compare yourself to others. I think it's completely fine to compare yourself to yourself and look at how you're progressing and if that lines up with the ideal version of yourself, the person that you want to be and aspire to become. But at the end of the day, there will always be things that you are better at than other people, and there are always going to be things that other people are better at than you. So the more quickly you can decide that you should only compare yourself to yourself, the easier it will be for you, especially with something like medical school, where they take the top of the top students oftentimes and put them all together. The comparison is the thief of joy quote is exactly what this refers to. Finally, if you've made it to this point in the video, thank you for watching, and I have an extra tip for those of you that are currently applying to medical school right now, and that is you should gear your application directly towards the AMCAS or whatever that is for the school you're applying to. For example, if you're in med school right now, gear that towards the ERAS. Now, you might be asking, what is that? A lot of times people wait until the end of their undergrad education when they're finally applying to medical school to look at the actual application itself. This is a very bad idea. To only listen to the people around you that tell you what you should be doing, you should look at the exact application and gear yourself as early as you can towards filling each of those components out. That way you know that there's direct intentionality in everything that you're doing. A key example of this is that on the actual AMCAS application, which is for medical school, there is a work and experience section, and there are 15 parts that you can fill out. Now, if you didn't know beforehand that there were 15 portions of this, and you had only, let's say, 8 experiences, then you would be leaving 7 things on the table that you otherwise might have had time to figure out if you looked at the application earlier. Additionally, there's probably a lot of things that you're doing that you think are important for your application that are not going to be sections on there in the first place. Another thing is that different medical schools have different recommendations for the types of applications that they expect. And for example, the letters of references will vary widely between medical schools. So if you know exactly where you want to apply beforehand, that can also really help gear your application towards those things. For example, if you're somebody that doesn't go to class a lot and has a hard time connecting with professors, if you know, hey, the school that I'm applying to has 3 letters of recommendation that are required, 2 of those need to be from a professor, and 1 of those needs to be from a physician, then you can choose 2 professors that you think you'd be able to get a great connection with, maybe that other students aren't all asking, because those professors oftentimes are the most busiest and write the most generic letters of recommendation, and target those by going to that class, showing up, asking questions after lecture, instead of waiting till the very end of class, or even worse, when you're graduating, to ask a lecturer or a professor for a letter of recommendation that oftentimes won't remember you because you didn't know you needed that letter in the first place. It can be really useful to listen to career advisors and other classmates, especially older students, but at the end of the day, the actual thing that the medical school or wherever you're applying is going to see is the application itself. So it makes the most sense that the things you do on a day-to-day basis should each be intentionally designed to fill one portion of that application so that you can maximize the way that you look when you're applying. It can be really daunting to look at the application, especially if you haven't already, but I can promise you the earlier you look at it, the better. And with all that being said, you should feel a lot more knowledgeable about some of the key changes to expect when you go to medical school. I hope that you got value out of this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like or a comment, and I will see y'all in the next video.